So
Ha.
thrilling that Rue is here, Rue Williams is here to talk about, what she's going to talk about, black skin, black lungs, evidence for environmental injustice in the Elizabeth River watershed. So, can everyone hear us? Yeah? Thank you.
Let's see if they can actually hear us. I'm assuming that they can. Okay.
Yep, we're good on Zoom.
Oh yeah, close it. Okay. So I am a Monroe scholar, surprisingly. And for my grant, I was able to do research on like any topic that I wanted to choose from. And I decided to do, my aunt lives in, she used to live in Chesapeake, she's in the Coast Guard. And I noticed that where she was living, there were a lot of landfills and a lot of oil terminals. And I went to her once and I was like, hey, Tigrid, this is predominantly Black area. And there happens to be, there happens to be a lot of like these pollutants and like facilities and whatnot. So I decided to do like some research on it and see if there was evidence for environmental injustice. It was something that I was very new to at the time. I'm not anymore, but the idea of environmental justice, it's a very like, it's not a new field, but it's definitely developing still. For those that don't know, environmental injustice is basically where people of color, lower income, even like gender, sexuality, older folks, people that are historically marginalized and also have fewer resources typically tend to actually be disproportionately negatively impacted by environmental issues. So I thought this would be a perfect case study because the area that I'm studying is lower income, predominantly Black, and you see a lot of serious pollutants in this area. So to start off, I just had a few quotes from the different locations that I'll be looking at. There's more than this, but these are just like the three that I thought were the most interesting. So where, can you see my cursor on the thing? Yeah, you can. Okay, so right here is the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Even though it's called Norfolk Naval Shipyard, it's actually in Portsmouth. I don't know what they were thinking. Very confusing. But it is actually considered a Superfund site. I'll go into later what that actually means. But there's a quote here, and it says, this new gas-fired plant would be built in a predominantly African-American community, overwhelmed by industrial pollution. The health of people who live in Portsmouth is already threatened by extreme concentrations of toxic waste from the 9 Superfund sites within a 15-mile radius. This plant would deal another blow to the community. I'll go into that later, what that really means and the consequences of that. To the left is a public housing community in Norfolk, incredibly lower income, predominantly Black. Again, I'll go into more depth into that later, but just a quick quote. It's the first building taken down in the multi-million-dollar St. Paul's area transformation, where they're referring to Sadler's Terrace, which is one of the, not Sadler's Terrace, they're referring to Calvert Square. Sadler Terrace is like our Sadler Terrace, wrong one. They're referring to Calvert Square, which is one of the 3 housing units in St. Paul's area. Again, I'll go into that more detail, but there's Calvert Square, Young's Terrace, and another one. But as I was saying, it's the first building, which is Calvert Square, to be taken down in the St. Paul's transformation. A plan to tear down the 3 public housing neighborhoods around downtown Norfolk and replace them with mixed income housing. I included that quote because one of the issues that I will also talk about later, these are all just like surface level, just like quick like introductions into what I'll be talking about, is the idea of gentrification and how that really enables environmental injustice. But the idea that they're tearing down these public housing communities that are predominantly Black and replacing them with mixed income historically has just meant we're going to put a bunch of white people in there. It's going to be very expensive. And you're going to see the property value increase and everything like that, whereas all the Black people are going to be displaced. So there is that, and I'll talk about that more later. And then lastly, at the very bottom, this is BAE Ship Repair, which is in South Norfolk. It is considered a corrective action site. Again, I will talk about that in a bit. But a variety of activities are presented at the shipyard, including ship repair, machine shops, offices, a wastewater treatment plant, and oil recovery and treatment facility. All of these, just a lot of hazardous material and storage of really hazardous stuff. And it's located in, again, a predominantly Black area. Please be quiet. Thank you. All right, moving on. Okay, so the concern, this is the Elizabeth River watershed, this beautiful depiction right here. My study areas are Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Chesapeake. When I say South Norfolk, I'm actually referring to this area right here, if you can see my cursor. It's called South Norfolk because it's south of Norfolk, but it's actually part of Chesapeake. Again, very confusing. But the Elizabeth River, the reason why there's so much industry in this area and why it's so contaminated is because the Elizabeth River was identified as one of the most polluted industries, tributaries rather, in the Chesapeake Bay because of the long legacy of maritime industry in the area. Hence why my aunt is posted there as a Coast Guard official, because they have just so many ships and docks and ports. The issue with this is like, with that brings really heavy industry. And in order to fuel all these things, they need power plants. They use a lot of like heavy metals and hazardous material, like asbestos, which I will go into in a little bit, stuff like that. And the issue is we're seeing, or at least according to my research, what you see is people of color and lower income people suffer the brunt of this. The contamination has resulted in brownfields, which I'll talk about in the next slide, Superfund sites and corrective action sites throughout the watershed. Again, because Norfolk, for example, has been an industrial port city for the past 400 years. So it's really just quite literally like in the soil and in the groundwater. Incredibly problematic. Okay, so what is a brownfield? So as stated by the EPA, a brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So the thing about brownfields is they are typically state regulated. They don't, like the federal government isn't gonna like reach in typically. It's typically the state or the city. So for example, for Norfolk, when I mentioned before the public housing community in Norfolk, which I'll get to in a little bit, they have 5 brownfields within their area alone. The unit of the housing in the area is also surrounded by several other brownfields. There's 5 within the actual housing complex, and then there are like several surrounding that. And so in 2017, City of Norfolk was given a grant by EPA to clean them up. And what they were finding for the brownfields that were in the St. Paul's area were that they are all formal industrial sites that have just a lot of like metal, typically heavy metals, and they're in economically distressed neighborhoods with high poverty rates. And most of the housing units are deteriorating because they're just so old. St. Paul's area was constructed in the 1950s. And since it's a lower income like housing community, they don't have the same upkeep as others. So these are the 3 that I was referring to: Tidewater Gardens, Calvert Square, and Young's Terrace. That's why I said cemetery. So yeah, it has a majority Black population. 5 of the 11 brownfields identified by the EPA or by the City of Norfolk from the grant that they got from the EPA, 5 of those are within or around the St. Paul's area, and there are 11 brownfields total. So they are, yes, suffering tremendously. I'll talk about in a little bit how you can see other brownfields elsewhere, but there's not nearly as many. For example, in downtown Norfolk, which is being gentrified and is predominantly white, with a mean household income of 102,000 around, I believe, they have like 2 brownfields. And so when you compare the 2, you're just seeing just how like impacted these individuals are and how like the contrast is just absolutely insane. Okay, so what is a Superfund site? I mentioned this earlier. A Superfund site is, by the EPA, an uncontrolled or abandoned site or properties where hazardous waste or other contamination is located. It's considered a Superfund site if the federal government is or plans to be involved in cleanup efforts. So Superfund sites, if you were to rank them, they would be considered worse than brownfields. So it'd be Superfund site and then brownfield. The issue that that is being seen and has been seen for a long time is that Portsmouth, which is known for being predominantly Black and lower income, I believe, continues to have like a stretch of environmental injustices. They have 9 Superfund sites within a 15-mile radius alone. And the Norfolk Naval Shipyard is also one of those Superfund sites that I mentioned earlier. The issue with the Norfolk Naval Shipyard is not just the shipyard itself, you know, like as I mentioned before, with like the contaminants, with like hazardous waste and whatnot, but they approved a power plant recently next to the community that is already like stricken with a plethora of environmental issues. And according to the Bay Journal, within a 2-mile radius of the project, 70% of the residents are members of a minority, and half qualifies living to at least one measure. And like I've mentioned before, the shipyard contained 4 Superfund International Priority List sites, 11 for storage sites, distribution terminals, and the shipyard itself is a Superfund site. One of the things that I was told by a lawyer that I spoke to, because I spoke to a couple of people, well, actually quite a lot of people when I was doing this research and as I continued the research. And I spoke to a lawyer who was part of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And she told me that whenever she goes to Portsmouth, because Portsmouth is like known for being an environmental justice area because it's just so stricken with these issues. And it's just a perfect example of how Black people of color are impacted by it. She went and she was doing work there and she spoke to one of the residents. And one of the residents told her a story about when her dad would come home from the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Or she didn't specify it was the shipyard, but she specified that it was like a factory or a facility or like an industry place. She couldn't remember because she was really young. He would come home and he would have the yellow stuff all over him. And the lawyer was like, you know, I assumed that it was asbestos. And I was like, I don't think asbestos is yellow. So I asked Brent, and Brent was like, it could be. So I did some more research just out of curiosity because I feel like that is just such a profound and important story. And apparently, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard is a Superfund site because of its handling of asbestos. It handles so much asbestos that they were like, yo, man, this is dangerous. So the story pretty much adds up. And again, when she told me that story, just hearing it from an actual human being rather than just, you know, researching this stuff really drove home like how pertinent this all is and how much it really impacts people. And it was actually quite sad and very scary for me, just like hearing that from another person. Like this is an actual reality. It's not just like something that you research. And then lastly, what is a corrective action site? So according to the EPA, a corrective action is a requirement under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that facilities that treat, store, dispose hazardous waste, investigate, and clean up hazardous releases into soil, groundwater, surface water, and air. And this is also regulated by the EPA. If you were to if we were to stratify them, if you will, it would be Superfund site, brownfield, and corrective action site. All terrible though. So according to my research, I use this map called Cleanups in My Community, which is the EPA. They have it on their website. There are 2 corrective action sites in Chesapeake, Virginia. And then there's a third one in Norfolk. And all of those areas, and I'll go into the statistics of when I say predominantly Black, what exactly am I referring to? I'll go into statistics a little bit later. But trust me when I say that it's predominantly Black and working class. All 3 sites have been cleaned up because part of the requirement of a corrective action site is once you start spilling out hazardous waste, you have to clean it up. But during that time when they were existing, a lot of them were going without regulation, hence why things were spilling, with people living around that area. So for example, former J.G. Wilson Corp was a metal and wood overhead door manufacturing facility. What a random thing. And the Virginia DEQ issued a non-compliance notice regarding the facility storage of hazardous waste and its plating, tanks, and baths. When I read this, I was like, wow, cyanide solution from electroplating operations, that's insane. Plating bath residues from the bottom of plating baths for which cyanides are used in the process. The issue here is it's not just like, one of the things I found from just like the research I did about how pervasive this all is and like how problematic it can be, is it's not just like people working there and handling, for example, the cyanide. It's when the cyanide goes into the groundwater. One of the main issues that I found when I was doing the corrective action site research, and it's a lot of this, they test the groundwater because they're really concerned about how it's going in, like how the hazardous waste that they're using is actually making its way into the groundwater, which the like surrounding community uses, or like sources their water from. And also just like actual like water, like into the river itself. That's why it's so polluted. Things like that. Okay. So I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit about statistics. I really wanted to focus on the Tidewater Gardens area specifically, and well, St. Paul's area specifically. So basically, if you look here, these orange little crosses, these little dudes are all brownfields. These red triangles are Superfund sites, and these blue outlines are corrective action sites. So St. Paul's area, the public housing community over here that I was referring to, is right here, right up here. And the city of Norfolk has its own issue of brownfields that they want to clean up. And they listed 11 brownfields. That's different from like the map, and the placement of the brownfields are different from this map, but overall it's somewhat consistent. There are just a lot, the conclusion that you can draw from this regardless, if you like cross-reference the two of them, is that there are a lot of brownfields in the St. Paul's area alone. So the issue here is not only is it just a lot of pollution and toxins in this environment, but most of the, I would say upwards of 90%. So if we were to break it down, 93% of the population was Black African American. For the like general area of like St. Paul's area, Calvert Square was 85%, Young's Terrace was 91%. What is really scary, so the St. Paul's area predominantly Black, upwards of 90%. The average household income is very low, especially compared to the downtown Norfolk area. The mean household income of Tidewater Gardens was $20,000, $32,000, and $16,000 for Calvert Square and Young's Terrace, respectively. So that's like barely making the poverty line. But then, like I said in the next paragraph, when you compare this to downtown Norfolk, which is again being gentrified and is predominantly white, 66% of residents are white, and the mean household income is like 102,000. They have like 2 brownfields. And the interesting thing about this is I found it very interesting and a little suspicious how, Norfolk especially has been an industrial port city for the past 400 years. And it was only recently that they were like, yes, we should clean these up now, in 2020. And that kind of like really correlates, in my opinion, from the research that I've done, to the gentrification of the Norfolk area. The Norfolk area started gentrifying in like the 1980s and 1990s, and they got their grant in 2020. So there is like a huge like gap. But the reason why I say that is because like that gentrification takes a while. And as the white community becomes more, or as the community in South Norfolk becomes more white and more upper class, there's more pressure for them to clean up these brownfields. And I'll get into that later, why I say that, this idea of like pressure on the city to clean it up because of their white population. I'll go into that a little bit later. But there's definitely, in my opinion, a correlation between the two. So for the South Norfolk issue with the corrective action sites, the majority population in South Norfolk is 49%, whereas the majority population of Chesapeake itself is like predominantly white. So it is an area that is considered predominantly, like, well, not predominantly, but like mostly Black, especially compared to the rest of Chesapeake. And the population located around the third site, which is the BAE Norfolk Ship Repair, is 91% African American. And when it comes to Portsmouth, 53% of Portsmouth population is African American and burdened with roughly 6 Superfund sites, according to cleanups in my community. There are a lot of different sources that say different things about how many Superfund sites are in Portsmouth. I saw one that said that there are 9 within a 15-mile radius, but like so my community doesn't identify 9. But again, based on all the information I've read, a lot of Superfund sites, far too many. There shouldn't be any in the first place, but there are several of them. But those are just some like quick, like you can see, even though it may not seem like a lot, like for example, South Norfolk 49%, and then the majority population of Chesapeake is 61. So you're like, eh. But when you put that in combination with the surrounding area, when you look at how close these guys are in vicinity to one another, so you have the public housing community here, you have Portsmouth here, and you have South Norfolk here, and they're all predominantly Black or have a very large Black population. And everything in regards to pollution that you can think of is clustered in these areas. So it's very, very fair and safe to say that you're seeing evidence for environmental injustice here when it comes to lower income Black communities being disproportionately impacted by these facilities and these problems. Okay. So why is this? A lot of words, I apologize, but there's a lot that goes into like why this happens. So there's an environmental sociologist that I really like. As a sociology minor, this was very interesting to me. She did a study, and it's called Toxic Communities, Environmental Racism, Industrial Pollution, and Residential Mobility. And she talks about like when urban areas were developing across the US, there were some that were reserved exclusively for residential purposes. And then there were some that were mixed areas where facilities and people could live. The issue with that is because people of color, due to the legacy of, institutionalized racism, could not afford exclusively residential areas. So they ended up moving in to these mixed use zones, and because they were more affordable. And this leads to a higher population density of people of color in those areas compared to the residential areas. So that's where you start seeing, and that just, another thing that I think is important to note, a lot of the times I read somewhere, and I've heard this before, and I like looked into it a little bit more. Back in the day, and even now actually, you can still see it because it is what it is. Like, Black individuals who live in areas, especially if it's a predominantly Black area, it significantly decreases the property value. So if you are already in a mixed area where you can have mixed use area where you can have facilities and residential areas, by being Black alone, just moving into that area already decreases the property value more. And then more facilities can move in because it's cheaper for them to move in. So it's just this ongoing cycle that never ends. And another thing is African Americans typically, and people of color in general, don't have the same resources to fight back. So I mentioned earlier that with the gentrification situation, you see a lot of white individuals in the downtown Norfolk area as it continues to gentrify. And I mentioned that as it continues to gentrify, you're seeing more cleanups happen. And the reason I say that is because typically what happens is with white groups in these areas, especially if they're impacted by environmental issues, they have more resources to fight back. And they also have, the privilege to fight back. Typically because of their affluence, or just literally just being white sometimes. I found evidence of that as well, which I'll go into a little bit later. They're able to fight back And another reason why facilities are actually more inclined to put their facilities in Black communities, other than the property value and whatnot, is because it follows a path of least resistance. They know that African Americans do not have the same resources or political or social standing to be able to fight back in the first place. So they're just like, this is it. We're going to put our resources here, and they're not going to be able to say anything anyway. And I found this research study that actually, one of the questions I had moving in to this research was, are Black communities established and then do facilities move in, or do facilities move in and then Black people come in? I was just curious, like, how that dynamic worked, because that definitely changes what is considered environmental injustice. An environmental justice study conducted by researchers at the University of Michigan and the University of Montana analyzed 30 years of demographic data regarding the placement of U.S. hazardous waste facilities, with the same question that I had, whether facilities establish themselves and then people of color move in because it's cheaper, or if hazardous waste facilities specifically seek out Black communities. And what they found was, over a 30-year period, hazardous waste facilities in neighborhoods where poor people and people of color live, they actually move into those. So they're already established, and those facilities go into these areas, which makes sense because based on everything else I've said, it's just easier because it's already, property values decrease because of mixed use zones anyway. Also, Black people living there, so the property value is going to be lower anyway. So again, path of least resistance is primary to what the facilities are thinking about. Next, solutions. Okay, so my sociology professor always makes the joke that sociologists complain, and then never provide a solution. And that is so funny to me. And it's very true. So one of the things, it's very true. They're just like, oh, these problems exist and they're so bad. Okay, good night. And it's like, bro, what are we supposed to do about that? So one of the big things for my research is I have an entire page 2, 3 dedicated to what the solutions are. And to be honest, I can't provide all of them, but one of the biggest things that I just speaking, one of the questions I asked all the people that I interviewed was, what are the solutions? And they always had a hard time answering that because I guess they really never thought about it. But one of the general consensus was, have individuals in the space making the decisions themselves. The lawyer that I spoke to was talking about how when they make these decisions, when a facility is like, oh, I want to move in, I want to build my power plant here on a slave grave, which actually happened once. I want to do that. Oftentimes, Black people or the people in the community are not involved in this decision-making process at all. There's a very insidious way that they do this to make sure that people don't actually come and have these conversations with them. One of the ways that they do this, according to the lawyer I spoke to, was they will put a little ad in the newspaper that no one reads anymore. They'll put a little ad in the newspaper in the corner on the 4th page saying, power plant wants build. And no one's going to read that. And one of the things that the lawyer I spoke to said was, it's a very strategic way to place your advertisement in a space where you know it's not going to be seen. And so the entire process goes on where no one knows about it. And by the time people find out about it, they already can't provide any input. She suggested that they should mail all of the community members an information pamphlet of what they want to do and what they're building. But apparently that's too expensive. They can't do that. It's too much money. Another thing as well in regards to solutions, in my opinion, is a lot of, this is not related to African Americans, but it's an incredibly important point. A lot of environmental injustice that you see nowadays are probably, I don't want to say the most popular, but the most profound examples are against the indigenous population in the United States when it comes to pipelines. I don't know if you guys know of Line 3 that's currently by Enbridge right now being built. But it endangers their water. It endangers their food sources. It goes through their burial grounds, sacred sites. and violates treaty rights and all these things. And I think when I spoke to Nikki Bass, who is she's part of the Nansemond tribe. She's amazing. I love her. And we were talking about just like, what is the solution for Indigenous people? And from that extension, by extension, for people of color at large. And she said that having Indigenous people in the space is important, but also just letting them like take a step back and let them do what they need to do as like stewards of the land and knowing the land better than anyone else, giving them reign to take care of it. And one of the statistics I found while doing this research is that while Indigenous populations are like 2% of the world's global population, they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. So having them be the stewards of their land and whatnot is incredibly important. And lastly, I think one of the things that I find very interesting is how people of color are not, this might be a very controversial statement, but as a Black person myself, and I've seen this like firsthand, a lot of Black people are unaware of what's happening, which is not their fault because like it's like specifically hidden, but a lot of them are unaware of what's going on. And a lot of them don't understand the toll that it could possibly take because most of them don't take geology. Most of them don't take environmental science like in that way to like look at this extent to which, and it's not just like Black people, like I feel like everyone does that. But again, African Americans oftentimes don't have that like same resource to like heavily investigate what this power plant means for their health. Like most people are not going to do that. And I think one of the biggest things is community science, having individuals, not in a like a white savior way, but having individuals come to communities that are plagued by these environmental injustices and having the conversation with them, providing them with the knowledge and resources, not necessarily resources, but the knowledge to be like, hey, this is going on. This is a really problematic danger to your health. You know, racism comes in so many forms. Most of the time we think of it as like George Floyd or police brutality, when in reality, that rhymed. It's mostly, it trickles down into every facet of society. It is institutionalized racism after all. So, you know, cancer rates being higher in the United States as a whole, in like Louisiana in one strip because of the power plant, stuff like that. It's very integrated into our society. So making that clear and helping the community understand that and ways to move forward provides them with the resources in the mind to be able to, okay, well, when the next newspaper comes out, I will look for these power plants trying to, you know, move in secretly. And then I will go to these, like I'll attend these meetings. I'll have conversations with them. One of the things I noticed, this is my last point, is when I was reading about the corrective action sites, all of the reports were like, we had a meeting today, no one showed up, so we're going to build it. We had a meeting today and no one showed up, so we're going to build it. And it's interesting how they're giving the community the opportunity to come in, but they know that the community is not going to come in because they don't provide adequate knowledge or information, so they can just do what they want to do. If the community is armed with that knowledge and the ability to be like, hey, man, don't do that. Come to these meetings, have these conversations. One, it's going to take those facilities by surprise. And two, it's probably going to enforce a lot more, like it's going to give them a lot more power over their community when they're actually actively fighting against these facilities and engaging with these facilities. But yeah, those are my like basic solutions. It's not a solve all situation, and it's incredibly complicated. And if I'm going to be cynical and very nihilistic about this, it's very difficult to solve environmental injustice when it is institutional and when, you know, white supremacy is so everywhere, you know what I mean? So that is all. These are my references. They're very small because there's so many. But yeah, that's basically it. Yes, no worries.
Stop sharing.
Sure.
We have a few minutes for questions, and Chloe, will you look at everyone clapping there. Chloe, could you look for chat? You can do those.
Wait, is that Becky?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Becky. Oh my God. Hi. Oh my God. Hello.
Hi.
Dude,
See you.
it's so good to see you. That's insane. Oh my gosh. I hope you're doing well. Oh my God. That's fantastic.
Questions for Ruth? There's a lot of information here.
There's so much, bro. That's not even all of it.
Yes.
There's so much.
Yeah.
Yes.
So as you were doing some of this research, did you get a chance, did you find any communities that had successfully blocked power plants or, chemical industry from coming in? Are there lessons to be learned for why that worked in some, communities and why it doesn't work in others, and how we can move forward really sort of in a solutions-oriented way to do that with other communities?
That's a really good question. So what I found that kind of reinforced the thing I was talking about before about like how white communities are able to get help faster. When I was researching success, most of the time it was like environmental injustices that were plaguing white communities, and they were able to do as much as they could. I found a research study by NRDC, and they basically said that what they found was African Americans go longer periods of time with environmental injustices without it being fixed. Whereas you compare that to white communities, and they'll have an environmental injustice and they'll get it on the right quickly. When I was researching for like Black communities that had success, or not necessarily in that way, but just like those, like what like the solutions were, a lot of the time you find that people that are helping from outside of the community that are aware. So for example, the lawyer that I was talking to, community science members that come in and are like, hey, this is what the issue is. Oftentimes it's what helps the most. It's not as effective as being white, but it helps to some extent. My only issue with that is, and when I was researching it, I was like,
Saviors again.
yeah, my issue with that is like when the community science members eventually leave, it's kind of like that thing that my dad always says, where it's like you give a man a fish and he eats once, but you teach him to fish and he can eat for the rest of his life. That's kind of what it reminds me of, where you come in and you help them and then you leave, and now they don't have, because part of the reason why they were succeeding in the first place is because you were there. One of the things in my last point that Taylor Lilly said to me, the lawyer, was that when she hates when people jump on environmental injustice as like a trend, because what you see happening, and it's basically kind of like answering the question in a way, what you see happening is people will do an internship on environmental justice. They'll do their project on environmental justice, and they'll go to a community and they'll be like, oh my gosh, and then they will never return to it again. They won't even reach out to anyone. They won't talk to anyone. So when you hop on it like it's a trend, it doesn't do anything. It just satisfies something for you, but it doesn't help the community at all. So yeah, it's crazy.
Anybody online want to ask a question? Thank you, Ruth. That was awesome.
I appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thank you.